Yellow, and happy year, I guess. It's not exactly new anymore. I'm late in making this, and now 2 of these are already out, and everyone has already talked about several of the strongest servants, a ton. But I really enjoy thinking about what's to come and planning ahead, and I thought it still might be helpful to role planning to cover every 5-star servant and show what they look like, and give a basic rundown in case there's someone you didn't know about who's not broken or anything, but that looks cool and that you vibe with. As well as to look at the overall timing of when the new servants are released. Speaking of which, credit for the calendar in the description. It's really good and looks really nice. It's worth noting though that not all of these banners will be coming to, or will be accurate for NA. For example, May is when JP got the Vinci Altria banner, but we've just gotten it in NA already in January. But that's not what we're looking at today anyway. I've edited the calendar a little to make it easier to see only the new servants that are releasing, and any reruns they might already get this year are also in blue. There's a total of 16 5-stars releasing this year. You can see that we have a couple in January, we get another 2 in February, 1 in March and April each. May's pretty much a dead month, especially now that even one of the 2 rerun banners isn't going to happen. Don't know if they'll replace that or give us pretty much anything to do. June's a lot busier though, with the release of Lost Belt 4 bringing another 2 new 5-stars, as well as a rerun for Shuwen already. July we get 5-star Nobu, and maybe also Da Vinci Rider might be in June rather than August for us on NA, as our anniversary is a little earlier. Speaking of August, it is of course summer, which brings another 2 new 5-stars. September just has a rerun of Murasaki from February, but we'll be too busy with the lotto for new servants anyway. We don't get a new Halloween event this year, but instead we get Saber Wars 2 and Space Ishtar. And then in November we have an early Christmas event bringing Saber Astolfo. And lastly, right at the end of the year, Lost Belt 5 releases, giving us another 2 servants. So there are a couple of months with no new releases. Instead, a lot of the new servants tend to get clumped together, which might be a problem if you want multiple in quick succession, but the downtime will at least, well, guarantee, if you don't want any of the reruns, that you'll have some time to save. I'll show on screen what reruns each servant has as well, while we talk about them, so that you can see if you can skip any and just get them later, and how long you'll have to wait and everything if you do skip them. Last thing then, before we get to the servants themselves, I just want to say, don't roll until after the anniversary if you can, as with the anniversary comes a gacha update that buffs the 5-star rate up and turns 10 pools into 11 pools, so it'll be quite a lot cheaper after the anniversary. It basically brings the average quartz for a rate up 5-star down from something like 450 to 340, which adds up very quickly. Finally, moving on to the servants themselves. Timecode and places in case you want to skip these first 2 with them already being out. But first up we have Gordon Ramsay herself, the Angry Burb. She's a single target arts saber with a near automata deck, and middling stats. Our attack and HP are pretty much right bang in the middle of all the servants in the game. For a saber, she is 8th out of 11 in both attack and health, although I should say, to be clear, that's out of everyone released in 2021, but doesn't include the 2022 servants. She not only has special attack damage on her MP, but 2 separate and stackable special attack damages for each chaotic and evil for 1 turn as well, so it'll apply to her face cards following her MP. Gives her quite a strong niche, especially considering the amount of chaotic evil characters in the game. Poor Eresh Kagal, gonna get wrecked by Benienma. She has an evade and a 40% crit buff, an AoE defense down, plus a bunch of utility effects, and effectively non-existent demerit. And on her third skill she has a charisma and a 20% charge, and again the same, just non-existent demerit, which is quite nice. Solid passives, arts up, crit up, and some star drop rate up to go alongside her high quick card hit count. So she should in theory be reasonable at star gen at least. And her Bond CE gives a further 15% each special attack to the whole party. Nice for her niche, although 15% is maybe a bit low for something so niche. Like, I feel like it could be 20%, but it's not like Bond CEs have a high bar to meet, so, you know. Looking at her animations, it's actually kind of surprising she's arts, considering how much her animations focus on speed and the quickness that you'd pretty much expect from a Sparrow. And I do like how she gets real small for her extra attack. It's pretty cute. So, if you summon her, just be careful not to say anything dumb in the kitchen or she might cut out your tongue. Otherwise, she's a pretty good servant. Single target arts Assassin with the Nier Automata deck this time. And on his NP he has an insta-death chance and a defense debuff that activates before the damage, which I don't believe is normally the case for defense debuffs on NPs, so that's pretty nice. It buffs the whole team's damage, but this time also buffs his own NP damage. For his skills, he has a 100% one-turn crit buff with Invincibility Pierce, so ain't nobody getting out of it. An Evade, Star Gather, and a 15-star Bomb, and basically a self-only Charisma with an added one-turn 30% attack buff and debuff immunity. So basically, Mana Burst with more uptime. Unlike Chef Ramsay and most 5 stars these days, it feels like, he only has one passive. But it is one that fits him, and it is basically 2, providing a nice little arts up and star drop rate up. His Bond CE provides a small arts and crit strength buff to the whole party. Probably not worth using, but hey, it's something. I really like the animation on his extra card, but is it just me, or is the initial little walking animation just slightly awkward? I don't know, it's still just a really cool animation, really. And I just generally like how his fighting style is animated and everything, how he uses his elbows and knees, and how it feels relatively like actual martial arts. The impact of each and pretty much every hit is also done just really well. They all feel really powerful and striking. Big Tiddy Goth GF is up next, an AoE arts caster with a double quick, double arts deck and a demonic special attack niche, and lets you finally inflict the hell that is buff block onto your enemies. Finally they can experience that pain. For her skills, she has a 30% defense debuff and a party-wide 30% demonic special attack to give everyone a taste of her niche. That sounds strangely lewd for something that isn't at all, I think. 30% battery and 20% NP buff for 3 turns, as befits an Arch Looper, and helps avoid the slight annoyance of combined charge debuffs a little. Then lastly, she has a defensive party buff that provides a damage cut and a 3-turn debuff immunity, which is pretty nice. Debuff immunity is often 1 turn, so 3 turns is a lot easier to get full use out of. She has 2 passives, an arts buff and a little something to help her 3 debuffs land, and her Bond CE provides a small 20% special attack to the party. Looking at her animations and stuff now, her 3rd Ascension actually kinda looks like a horror monster to me, but I just love how chill her MP is.
限りあれば薄墨衣朝けれど涙ぞ袖を 打ちとなしける源氏物語葵もののけ
Really, her attacks in general. I think her voice acting is just really relaxing, I guess. It's just so nice and chill. And her extra card is just lovely. Just very pretty. And she has a fucking Buster Beam. Just compared to the rest of her animations, it's silly, but it's also great and I love it. Her goth form, on the other hand, is still really cool, but it just doesn't have quite the same chillness to me as the third ascension does. It's still, I mean, it still has the same kind of voice acting and stuff, it's just a little lessened. But I could see myself being the only one that prefers and might primarily use third ascension. But it's just nice. I just like it. Her book dropping animation in her gothic form is just really funny though. I love that. On to Big Sakura now though. She's an AoE limited buster alter ego with another Nier Automata deck. To go with her massive body, she has the gimmick of a massive HP pool from one of her skills. Base stat wise, her HP is only 73rd in the game though, and second lowest of all the alter egos. However, her attack is up there as the second highest in the whole game, and so of course is also higher than every other alter ego. Her third skill is her simplest, so I'm going to start there this time. It's a monstrous strength, which gives her 40% attack, just 10% short of a mana burst, but for 3 full turns. It's her first skill where things get interesting though. It applies a 10 turn buff that increases her max HP by 3000 per turn on a 10 turn cooldown. A year and a half after her release it gets buffed to be 4000 per turn and gives an additional 8% NP damage resist every turn for those 10 turns. This is her only defensive skill, so it's a good thing that they did at least add the MP resist, because even with 40,000 HP, that's still not enough to survive most Noble Phantasms, especially when it's neutral damage she'll be taking. Our second skill reduces our cooldowns by 1 turn, and removes the buffs from the first skill, in exchange for NP charge. At 20% per stack of the first skill's buff, this can be a hell of a battery, but if we look at our MP again, you'll see that while it has a 20% buster buff increasing with overcharge, it also has another separate 20% buster buff that requires the buff from her first skill to be active, which her battery removes. So this means that in a lot of instances, especially in shorter farming, if you use her MP battery, you're giving up a reasonable chunk of NP damage. Our kit is pretty interesting and fairly unique like that, really. It has a lot of give and take, so that you'll have to think about what to use in each scenario that you could run into. For passives, she has a buster up, a crit up, an arts up, debuff resist and some small flat bonus damage, and then lastly a flavour passive with no effect. Our Bond CE gives her an extra 20% buster up for herself, 40% in total if she has her first skill buff active, but as a demerit she reduces the party's quick by 10%, which isn't too bad because you're probably not going to be running her in a quick team. This does also add to the give and take in her kit by making it so that if you use her battery before her MP, you'll lose a total of 40% buster up rather than just 20. So it would probably only ever be worth using this CE in setups where you know you don't need her battery, and that's if it's worth using at all. In battle, I love how she shuffles about when she needs to move, it's just so cute. I also like that for one of her attacks she just chucks a boulder as well. And her extra attack's funny, how she just looks like she's just kind of throwing a tantrum. And then one of her quick animations is just her flicking the enemy as well with her giant finger. And bloody hell, her second ascension kaiju voice lines are so cute. the atomic breath she has in second ascension is especially great. Although how these specific enemies attack her is pretty funny, shall we say. Overall, her animations are just really cute and funny. And gameplay wise, she can do more damage than Okita Alter and has a pretty good battery, so she should be pretty useful. I find it hard to tell with her really because of how unique and interesting her kit is. Next up is a little something for everyone. A single target limited Skadi Looper Quick Assassin with a double quick double buster deck and a charm and extra 20% stackable quick buff on her MP. Kinda funny to have a charm on an MP, kinda makes the enemies masochists really when you think about it. But hey, whatever they're into. Her first skill increases an ally's overcharge level, but at the cost of permanently reducing their maximum HP by 1000. It also heals herself for 4000 though. For her S2 she has a guts and 30% attack buff, and her third skill is a 50% battery that makes her charm easier to land for 1 turn. It also increases her crit strength by 20% for 3 turns, and has the unique effect of giving her full class advantage against alter egos for 3 turns, making her the only servant in the game with class advantage against them. However, it only has 50% uptime, and the rest of the time she'll be at a disadvantage instead, dealing neutral damage and taking 1.5 times damage. Still, the only alter ego counter in the game, and her S1 and S2 both increase her survivability, so she can probably take the damage fine. She has 4 passives: 20% debuff resist, quick up, a small crit boost with some other negligible effects, and complete charm immunity with a small flat damage boost. And her Bond CE increases parties quick by 15% and crit by 20%. Whoo boy, how am I going to show her animations in a reasonable time? Thankfully I don't have much to say for her first ascension, except that her animations are actually a lot like Arjuna's. I know they're both Indian, but I don't know how connected they are beyond that. It's not something I really considered until now. I'll be curious to maybe, hopefully, find out when she comes out. With her second ascension, she stops using the bow quite as much though, and instead uses the thing she has for attacks a lot more. Especially her extra card. She pretty much exclusively uses that thing for it. And the explosion it ends in is pretty cool. I think her second ascension might actually be my personal favourite look. It's a little less over the top than the third, although I like the boss feeling that the third one has. But I think I'm in the vast minority. I hardly ever see anyone use or choose her second ascension. Let me know if anyone feels the same and what your favourite ascension is, because they're all just so different. Anyway, moving on to her third ascension, it becomes a lot more energy weapon focused, and she pretty much drops the bow entirely. I really like the beam she does as her third quick. The angle reminds me of Gallic Gun. She also looks like she's burning up, especially with one of her skill use animations. It kind of emphasises why I think her limbs look like that, I'm not sure. Lastly, her MP also changes completely and still looks awesome and much more cosmic now really. On to Waver but Worse. Reines El-Melloi is a support rider with a double quick double arts deck. Her MP decreases all enemies' defense by 30 to 50% depending on MP level, decreases their crit rate as overcharge, removes all debuffs from herself, and also negates defensive class disadvantage for the team. She basically has Waver's second skill as her first, increasing defense, providing a damage cut, and providing 10% charge. Her second skill provides a targetable 40% attack buff with a 20% attack demerit for herself, both for 3 turns, and also charges the target's NP by 20%. And then her third skill is Volumen, giving an ally 2 hits of invincibility for 3 turns and increasing their debuff resist. The debuff resist being all that scales with level. After a little more than a year, this gets buffed to also provide 20% MP charge, completing her Waver cosplay and finally giving the skill something to scale with level. Her passives increase her debuff resist and quick and arts card effectiveness, and her Bond CE increases party's arts by 15%. I was writing notes for this part to explain why I called her just Waver but worse, but then I noticed by the end it was like 6,000 pages long and wasn't exactly notes anymore, so I might just make a separate video on her or something. But to say quickly, her main gimmick of nullifying class disadvantage is a defensive one, and I just don't feel like she brings enough other forms of defensive utility to be worth putting her on like Berserker teams just for that ability. And also for the fact that for a whole year without her buff, she really is definitely entirely worse than Waver. That alone means I 100% recommend skipping her until her next rate up comes alongside her buff, when she'll also be cheaper to roll for after the anniversary gacha buffs. And I still don't know if she's worth it even then, but if you do want her, at least wait until she's cheaper to get. Onto her animations though, and I haven't seen anything with Reines in it yet, but the fact that her maid seems to be Volumen is really cool. I kinda don't like her NP though, because it feels like it's missing an impact at the end. Like the sea should be suddenly coming up and exploding on the enemies or something. It just kind of feels like it's building up and building tension to something and then just kind of nothing really happens. At least to me anyway. Her animations with the maid are really cool though. The way the lines it attacks with are angular when it turns into a slime ball, the fact that it becomes a horse for her, or gets hammer arms to punch with, or even how it blocks attacks for her, is all just really cool. With Lost Belt 4 comes Big Tubby Elephant GF, a permanent AoE Mooncancer with a triple arts deck. I didn't realise until making this that she was AoE arts actually. But that's probably because you shouldn't be fooled by the fact that she has AoE damage on her MP. Her primary role is support, which becomes clearer when you look at her stats. She has the lowest stated attack stat in the game, but in exchange has the highest health pool at least. Her NP gives herself invincibility, heals herself, and reduces all enemies' defense by 30%, just like Waver and the like. But it also applies before the damage she deals, giving her a bit of a damage buff at least. Her first skill is actually basically Dreamlike Charisma, but somehow better, because while it has an extra turn of cooldown, it provides an extra 15 stars per turn in exchange. It's hard to lose out on those stars entirely either, because the star gen is spread across the whole party. Her second skill gives herself Taunt, a damage cut, and a 30% attack buff, and combos very well with the invincibility on her MP, as well as bringing her damage up to a tickle rather than being non-existent. Lastly, her third skill is a targetable invincibility with a small NP gain buff, but has the demerit of applying Skill Seal. The main problem with which is that it effectively increases skill cooldowns by one whole turn. She has a passive 20% debuff resist, a quick card buff so her one quick can maybe do at least something, and a small flat damage bonus. Her Bond CE is pretty fantastic for a Bond CE, being a base 2030 that also heals the party a little every turn. Aesthetically, I'd love that her first ascension is a thing. And the voice effect it gives her, great. Her first arts animation is pretty funny too, how it's just a simple bonk. It looks so cheap without actually looking cheap. The way she spins for her extra card and skill animation adds a lot though. Makes her feel more three-dimensional, even though she's just an unmoving statue. I wasn't able to tell until her later ascensions, but her NP is basically just a belly slam, and she also gains another belly slam as just a regular attack. I like how she throws the dumplings at the enemies too. She throws them really consistently, I guess. I'll have to be careful if I ever use her though that my phone screen brightness isn't too high, because oh boy, that extra card is bright. Does look cool though, but it doesn't really matter how cool it looks if I'm blinded by it. I know she isn't used much, or I think even considered very good, but I look at her kit and I don't get it. Just looks pretty good to me. Seems like a decent support. There's no doubting the strength of the second LB4 servant though. Arjuna the Busted Buster Boy. He's a limited Buster Berserker with a triple Buster deck, an AoE MP, and the first gold AoE Zerker to have a battery. His NP is pretty straightforward. Like Karna and Okita Alter, it also decreases enemy Buster card resist. Except his activates before damage, which works perfectly with his first skill, which, in addition to giving him a 30% attack buff, also applies 50% special attack damage against debuffed enemies. Meaning that, with just that and his MP, he already has a massive 100% damage boost from 3 different buff types. In case you didn't know, FGO calculates buffs multiplicatively, which means that in actuality his buffs reach a total of 134%. And 2 of his buff types are relatively rare as well, which means external buffs with things like Buster Up or an MP strength buff are going to scale even harder. His second skill is not only a 30% battery, but also a huge Buster Star Gather buff, just so that he can crit like hell as well. Bear in mind that his 50% special attack is a general buff and not just on his MP, and those Buster crits are going to hit for insane damage as well, as long as you've either already MP'd the enemies or have anyone on your team that can provide any sort of debuff. Also, if you can provide him with an external crit damage up like from Merlin, that's another different buff type that will scale more yet again. His third skill is easily as least broken, being a 3-turn Guts with 3-turn HP regen. The fact that they're both for 3 turns makes it slightly awkward to get the full benefit of both, and the Guts only lasting for 3 turns when it has a 7-turn cooldown at max isn't too great. Still though, really just the fact that he has any survivability, let alone that one that does still both heal him and is a Guts, on an offensive powerhouse like him is a pretty big deal really. He only has 2 passives, but of course they both increase his damage, with the highest rank of a flat damage boost as well as the highest rank Madness Enhancement, EX, for another 12% damage. Then lastly his Bond CE is pretty fantastic for a Berserker as well, being Volumen, or kinda more accurately an MLB Bittersweet with an extra hit of invincibility instead of stats. Hopefully I've made it clear just how busted he is, because gameplay wise he is basically the servant of the year, putting out damage that can compete with most other AoE servants, while being universally useful as a Berserker, and being able to handle even single target fights with his survival skill, crit capability, and the fact that all of his buffs apply to his face cards as well. His overall banner is even pretty great, with a cool story locked 4-star and a fantastic story locked 3-star healer also on the banner. Just about all that's not exceptional about him are his stats, having only the 45th highest attack in the game compared to his base version's 16th and 50th in HP. Even among Berserkers he's only 5th out of 10, although he is at least 3rd in HP. Still though, Berserkers as a class have a 1.1 times attack modifier, and with that many buffs, I'm sure he'll make do. I also think even his animations are just really cool. I dig the whole cosmic thing. although it is strange how much calmer he sounds as a Berserker. He does start to regain a more normal voice in his 3rd ascension though. I love the celestial objects that he's just always holding. It makes him look fittingly godly for how strong he is. And I love his arts animation where they just become a spectral horse out of nowhere. It's really surprising and cool. He's still pretty archery too, really. Not just because of the archery he does in his extra card either. He pretty much never actually melees or touches the enemy. All his attacks are still pretty much ranged, even in his awesome NP. Pretty much all his art is great, to be honest. Like, that final Ascension art is just beautiful. I'd be surprised if they don't sell posters or something of it. And speaking of great art, from one of the most broken servants to one of the most unfortunately broken, top tier waifu, bottom tier servant, Maou Nobu. An AoE limited Buster Avenger with a triple Buster deck and an anti-divine niche on her MP. I wish I could say she at least has good stats. If you don't look closely it might seem like it, having the 7th highest attack in the game. But on her release she's tied with Edmond Dantes for the lowest attack among the Avengers. It only gets worse though because she's also tied for the lowest HP with Jolter. So she manages to have not only the lowest attack, but also the lowest HP in her class. And that means that her HP isn't just tied for the lowest of the Avengers, but in the whole game. Jolter at least has her mighty attack stat, highest in the whole game to justify her HP. What does Maou Nobu have? Nobu's attack stat is unfortunately still one of the best things she even has going for her. Her first skill turns the field into a burning one. It won't change anything visually, and it's also a kind of weird attack buff that increases over time. On the first turn it's 30%, then 50% on the next turn, and at the end, on the 3rd turn, it reaches 70%. As a trade-off, it also deals a total of 3000 damage to her as a burn, which is rough when she has such a low base health pool. Second skill is basically just a 1-turn invincibility. Very basic for when she's released, but it does get maybe one of the weakest buffs I've seen to also give her 50% special attack damage against Heaven attribute enemies. Then again, my initial reaction is always that it's a weak buff, but she can give herself the burning field, and Heaven is an attribute not a trait, so it should apply to about almost 1/3 of the game's cast. Still, for what she needed, it's a very weak buff. Her last skill is a 20% battery that also gives 10 crit stars per turn. 20% is a pretty small battery, especially when it scales with level. It's really annoying because it often ends up being useless until level 10. But 10 crit stars per turn is a fair chunk at least. Although I still don't think it justifies how small the battery is. For passives, she has the Avenger passive that increases defensive NP gain, but makes the rest of the party more susceptible to debuffs, a very low rank and almost non-existent crit buff, and some NP gauge per turn. Lastly, her Bond CE is a party-wide one that increases Buster and NP damage, but decreases defense. Overall, gameplay wise, she's really bad. Her battery's really small like I said, she doesn't have any way to utilise the stars it provides herself. She apparently, because I can't use her myself, has low overall MP gain. Her second skill is really basic and on a 6-turn cooldown, and even the buff it gets is situational. Her first skill deals 1/4 of her health and damage to herself and is very slow, so isn't necessarily there when you need it. It's also the only damage buff in her entire kit, and you have to wait 3 turns if she doesn't die to get full use out of it, and with her MP gain she won't be NPing twice in that window. And even once it's fully ramped up, her damage is still pretty piddly. She's also AoE, and as an Avenger that makes it harder to deal any worthwhile damage or to really take advantage of fighting a strong, divine, and eventually heaven enemy. I think most situations where you'd really want to bring a special attack counter, it would be a boss, and so single target that you would ideally want. The defense removal also only applies to divine enemies, which is just pointless in my opinion. She basically just doesn't do anything. About all that makes her worthwhile is her looks, and thankfully there is a lot to like there. They put a ton of work into her visually, giving her 3 totally different ascensions and some good animations. Like, her NP is awesome, and one of the most animated and I think fluid that I've seen. It almost looks like actual anime. Her extra card is so ridiculous and amazing, how she turns herself into a gun wheel. She pulls out a freaking Gatling gun for her buster animations and then proceeds to also use it to bash enemies' heads in and also stick into their stomachs to shoot. She also does an aerial barrage with it as one of her quicks that's really well animated, with how the barrel basically multiplies to make it look like it has a ton of recoil and is moving a lot. Her second ascension animations seem to be identical, but her third ascension has some new ones and they're amazing. Like for her quick card, the way she raises her leg and then does a spin kick is amazing. For a second I wondered if she was doing the meme raised leg pose. Her extra is a great evolution as well, and also just cool as all hell. Now that she's older and badass, she doesn't just use the Gatling gun, she fucking one-hands it while also using the weapons from one of her earlier animations where she shoots a load of floating guns around her. Her skill animation is another good show of her progress, where after she sits down the fire is noticeably much bigger, and it even causes her hair to go flying up, all while she just stares menacingly while still smiling. Her animations are all so powerful now. Her buster card punch creates a big pillar of fire. Her quick ends in a big demonic looking blast of energy. She even breathes damn fire now. She has another extra animation too, where she just pretty much explodes with fire and it sends her hair flying again. She also has another skill animation where she drinks out of a skull like a badass. Her animations and just how she looks in general is amazing. And it's so annoying because it makes me really actually want her, but she's easily one of the worst servants in the game with pretty much no use. DW gives servants niche special attack damage, I think to specifically make it easier to give every servant some basic use. But anti-divine damage is a dime a dozen and easy to get someone with actual class advantage. Her buff that adds more special attack still doesn't make up for that, barely bringing her damage above that of just a reasonably strong normal NP. Let alone an anti-divine servant able to deal actual effective damage as well, or a single targeter. And pretty much any other servant you bring isn't going to kill themselves to be able to eventually get their full damage. You could kinda say she gets a buff towards the end of 2022 with the release of Nobunaga. He can provide a lot to her, but everything he provides also applies to the other, better Nobus. And having to have a certain servant on the team who'll die pretty quickly still isn't great. And even then his release is a long time after hers, so there's no reason to roll for her on release when the gacha rates are also worse. She's just so disappointing, and she's wasted in pretty much every way except the fun one. Moving on to a better servant and less of a downer, the next servant released is Vinci Rider, the anniversary servant. She's a limited AoE rider with an Arts NP and a Nier Automata deck. On her MP she has a 20% charge for the party, so works wonderfully for arts teams, and is easily capable of looping with Castoria, allowing her to provide a lot of charge. Her first skill provides even more charge for herself too, makes Maou Nobu's battery look like a joke. It gives her 20% charge per turn for 3 turns, as well as a heal and a full 3 turns of debuff immunity. This is more the kind of charge over time skill that I can get behind. Several servants have 10% per turn, which is just a pain compared to getting it all at once, or, like in this case, getting what you need every turn. Fits and Art's looper too, because it allows her to NP easier every turn, rather than for just one NP like normal batteries. Second skill is a 1-turn evade and crit buff. The crit damage is a little low for a 1-turn buff, but it's in addition to the evade, and she's not primarily a crit servant, so... It's also on a fantastic and abnormally low 4-turn cooldown. The last skill is the most interesting to me, and is her steroids. It increases NP damage by 30% for 3 turns, as well as charging NP gauges by 10% and increasing everyone's overcharge level by 1. Although only for 1 turn. So most of the time, at least in farming, it's actually just an extra steroid for herself, to increase the arts buff her MP gives her by 5%. I really like overcharge up buffs though, and it's what has me most tempted to get her or Karma. It's just neat. Overcharges can be interesting. She has a passive arts up, a slightly larger quick up, and both debuff resist and star drop up by 20%, and her bond CE is pretty interesting, increasing arts star gather rate by 100% for the team. I don't know if it's really much use at all, but it's fairly unique and could be fun to mess around with at least. Now, I haven't read the Lost Belts yet, so I don't know if there's context for most of her moves, like why she has toy-like tanks in her extra cards. But what's cool is cool. Like her ice skating. I don't know why she does it, but it does look really nice and fluid, I guess. Her backpack arms are neat as well. They remind me a little of Doc Ock in one animation in particular. I do wish her NP was cooler though. Maybe it's just because I don't have the full attachment to the vehicle that you're in for the Lost Belts, but I don't know. The last shot of driving into the horizon is really nice regardless though. By far my favourite animation she has, however, is the bow for one of her quick attacks, where she shoots rockets out. It's just silly, like they're almost falling out of her bag, and it's great. After the anniversary, it's finally summertime! The first new servant it brings is mUSAshi. Tip my fedora. The first AoE Arts Berserker. She's limited, as summer servants tend to be, and has a near automata deck for a nice balance between Zerker Buster goodness and having what an arts servant needs. Her NP's pretty strange. It virtually doesn't have an overcharge. NP seal to Sabers on a farming Berserker is so situational it might not as well be there. It's really strange that they didn't even just make the crit rate debuff she has the overcharge. Why? Anyway, her first skill is a repeat of Lolly Vinci's, the exact same crit and evade. Her second is an alternate version of her fully clothed self's first skill, increasing the hit count on her normal attacks and then increasing the damage with level. Arts only this time though. It also now has an NP game buff too, which is nice for a skill that would already be focused on increasing card NP gen. The NP gen buff lasts for a full 3 turns too, perfect for farming. Her final skill allows her to hit pretty much anyone and boosts her attack and decreases enemy defense both by 30%. It's also a Guts, however it deals a huge 5,000 damage to herself as a demerit, making her really squishy as a low HP Berserker. Her HP is 101st out of all the servants in the game, and 8th out of the 10 Berserkers, so that 5,000 really does hurt. But on the upside, her attack is 4th overall, and 2nd for a Berserker, behind only Bro Alter. For passives, even though she's arts, she has Madness Enhancement EX, and then a small quick buff, but nothing at all for arts. She also has a small flat damage boost and some debuff resist. Her Bon CE only increases her NP damage by 30% and gives buff removal resist. Like, even not compared to Arjuna alters, that's pretty trash, unfortunately. Unlike her animations. For her first two ascensions, her NP has her riding a jet ski to attack her enemies, and I like how she stands on it towards the end. I don't know why, it's the same thing with Maid Alter's NP. It just looks cool, them standing precariously on their vehicle and being able to attack. I'm not sure why she's using brightly coloured batons as her weapons though, but at least with only a couple of sound effects, you basically have another Star Wars servant. I like her general stance though. I wish Summer Umu stood like that in her first two ascensions as well. Although, I might actually prefer how she crosses her arms and looks ready for business in her second ascension. For one of her busters, she does a cross attack, and I like the pause and build up it has before the attack. Builds a bit of tension. Then lastly, for her extra attack, the jet ski comes out again for some fun. Our second ascension seems to be mostly the same except for the jet ski becomes red. She also has some awesome gun blades rather than the batons. Her animations have to change a ton with her third ascension however, as she's no longer dual wielding and instead has one long sword now. For her extra attack, she seems to have taken some inspiration from Altria, finally becoming a true Saber now that she's a Berserker. I'm not sure what the coloured orbs or beams actually are, but I'm sure it'll come up during the event. Otherwise, her attacks now and the third ascension generally often swoosh some water too now. And lastly, her NP changes, and she's ditched the jet ski. I guess she no longer needs it, for she has become the jet ski. And from a jet ski to a bunny, Artoria Ruler is an AoE buster ruler that retains her Lancer deck. Her NP has pretty much the standard Artoria NP refund, but also increases not just her buster, but all card types for a turn as the overcharge. She's not a looper, but thinking about it, it sure would be nice if it was a 3-turn, or even 2-turn buff actually. That would be a very big difference though. Her first skill is a 40% battery and an evade. It's also an Ishtar style delayed buff for 30% attack. A little annoying and awkward, but something you can get used to. This is a 6-turn cooldown though, rather than Ishtar's 4, making it more punishing to use at the wrong time. But because it also has 2 other effects, it will be really awkward, as all 3 effects you'd probably want to use at different times. So trying to time that delayed attack buff right, it's going to be a pain. Her second skill is her totally unique one, especially post buff. On release, it's essentially the skill from the Atlas Academy Mystic Code, but also with a nice party crit buff and a reasonable cooldown. But a year after her release, it gets buffed to be truly unique and interesting. After the buff, it allows you to select an ally to not have their command cards drawn, effectively guaranteeing a brave chain for someone. It needs more than 1 servant to activate, but that means you can activate if there's only 2 left alive as well, allowing to get only 1 servant's full deck in the probably rare instances you're down to just 1 other teammate. That does also mean though that if she's solo, she can't get the crit buff and the other things that the buff adds, because it also has its cooldown reduced and has an additional party-wide NP gain buff for a turn. It's a really good buff, making her truly unique, and making the other buffs on the skill like crit and NP gain more useful by increasing the odds of getting the cards you want to use with them. Her third skill then is pretty much a monstrous strength with a 1-turn Stargather buff, allowing her to crit along with her crit buff on the second skill. Passive wise, she only has a debuff resist up and some arts up, unfortunately nothing for her buster NP or to further increase crit damage. Although her Bond CE does at least help with that. It's party wide, which fits her fairly well as pretty much a semi-support. It provides 15% crit damage and 10% attack to all allies, and she'll need whatever extra attack she can get, having the 102nd ranked attack in the game. Easily one of the lowest, even being the second lowest among other rulers. She does, however, at least have the second highest HP in the game, and the most of all rulers, which isn't too bad for her as a semi-support and as a ruler that pretty much resists everything. I just personally wish that she was single target, I think. It would fit her role better, I feel, and allow her to maybe do some degree of damage. Her damage isn't actually too bad though, compared to what you might think from her stats, as she does have a good amount of total steroids if you can line them up right, and she is also capable of critting. Maybe it's just Maou Nobu making her damage look good in comparison though. Even if she's not that great, she still at least has a reason to bring her over someone else. And that thing is fun too. I love some of her animations as well. The Golden Lightning Lion in one of her skill animations and Buster attacks is absolutely awesome to me. It sometimes goes straight for the enemy's throat, very much like a lion would, and its other animation instead has it explode with light or lightning. It's just really cool. I guess I just like animals. A lot of her other animations then have her using her Uno cards to attack with. Sometimes slashing with them, like with her quick, sometimes throwing them in a bit of a barrage. Her extra card is totally different to most of her other attacks though, instead being a beam of light. Her NP is quite summery and Vegas-y, but it's also another one like Bradamante's, where the camera holds on the plot a little gratuitously. But it does overall look really nice. How she's just cruising along, chilling with a drink, and then jumps into the night sky and leaps across the moon. It's very pretty. Although I'm not sure how I feel about the way she initially trots off the boat. I think the animation might be a little strange. For her second ascension, she ditches the bunny suit for a more refined poolside aesthetic, with a parasol as her primary weapon, which leads to some unique animations for this ascension. Some of my favourite animations for her too, I think. How she attacks and stabs with the parasol is cool. I especially like the animation leading up to her attack on her quick and extra cards, where she pulls it back ready to strike. I initially thought the second ascension was my least favourite of her designs, but now I'm not sure. I think it might just be her default stance, as when she moves, or doesn't, as in the case of her skill animation where she just takes a second to have a seat in a cuppa, her design looks really good. I think it's just how she stands normally. Her MP animation also changes for her second and third ascensions. Now, rather than leaping off the boat at night, the boat leaps off the sea during the day, and then fires a big beam at the enemies. It's also not as gratuitous as the first NP, instead pretty much just having a noticeable jiggle at one point. The second ascension is probably the most unique animation-wise of the three, except for it sharing the NP with the third ascension, which returns to a more bunny-like aesthetic, although more cosmic, or maybe divine, I guess. Other than the NP, the animations are all pretty much the same as the first ascension, except for a quick teleport before the regular arts animation, and another arts animation where she shoots some things from her floating back circle. Her extra attack also makes a little more sense now in this form, and isn't slightly out of place like it was for the first ascension. For this next servant, is it just me or does the first ascension card art remind you of Asuka? I think it's the look of disdain more than a physical resemblance. Same energy. Space Ishtar is a limited AoE Avenger with a Nier Automata deck, and the major gimmick of being able to change your NP card type. She also has a stackable 3-turn NP damage buff on her NP, as well as a unique 100% buff to extra card damage. It's not the most useful or impactful thing in the world, but it is another unique thing, and extra cards can do quite a lot of damage too when it's in a buster chain. Maybe that's even the intent, as kinda a buff to make using her NP as buster more viable. Who knows? Her attack stat is far from bad, being 9th in the game overall, but is dead last among the Avengers. Her HP is the opposite story, being 85th in the game, but the highest of any Avenger. She has a stronger charisma for her first skill, It still only buffs her own attack by 20%, but it buffs the party's by a whole 30% instead. Quite a smartly made skill when I think about it, because everything about Space Ishtar, including her MP change gimmick, is pretty much about her being supported as the DPS. So making the party buff pretty strong kinda opens up her uses without almost any chance of being broken either. Her second skill is what gives her her major ability, but it is for 3 turns on a 5-turn cooldown. Her MP is arts by default, so it won't matter there, where she's also ended up being the strongest anyway, but that could be an issue sometimes in quick or buster teams. Especially because the skill also gives her a 20% NP strength buff, but only one time. Which means, like, if you tried to 3-turn quick loop with her, you'd likely be wasting a steroid on the first and weakest wave. Lastly, the skill also gives her a 1-hit invincibility for 3 turns, and that's her only form of survival. Her last skill is a lovely 50% battery with an 80% chance each of a 20% card type buff for 3 turns, and this is one thing I'm not sure about. I know with Castoria's release she becomes pretty much the best farmer in the game, but I'm not sure how her missing her arts buff affects things. I guess it's just a small enough buff that it doesn't matter, I suppose. She's another servant that has a ton of passives, actually the most passives of any servant releasing this year even. She has a total of 42% debuff resist, although she reduces allies resist, a flat damage bonus, increased defensive NP gain, 3.5% free charge each turn, and a total of 16% crit damage, which is quite a lot for passive crit. Her bond CE is basically useless, but it does fit her theme. It gives 8% for each card type to all allies. She's another servant with 3 completely different looks for her ascensions, and probably some of the most divergent aesthetics in the game, maybe. Her first ascension is kinda hard to describe, like a badass space warrior. Second ascension is Cowboy Bebop, and her third ascension is like a cosmic being. As a kind of trade-off for the varied aesthetics, her MP doesn't change between ascensions, however. I really like her MP though, I think it looks cool. But my friend mentioned he finds it kinda creepy, because it looks like a rin-faced corpse just floating around. For the actual move animations, they're really different between ascensions. First ascension has a lot of slashing with her dual swords. One of the only times she doesn't seem to attack directly is her extra card, and that's only for the first part because she quite awesomely comes in from off screen for a leaping attack. The other is her third arts, where she blasts the enemy with dark energy. Not like the theoretical dark energy that's in physics. I just mean like energy that is dark and red and kind of straight out of Thor the Dark World. The general aesthetic with the glowing lines and everything on her is really cool, especially in her skill animation where you kind of get a better look at it, and I think the lines seem to glow more. It's a lot like Reines' look from Fate Extra, really. Second Ascension's animations are a lot more upbeat. She basically just poses for one of her skill animations and does a gun twirl for the other. They're also a lot more flashy, like her Buster has a whole ton of colourful energy coming off her sword slashes, and she does a sword spin. For her extra, she pulls out a weird thin blue cannon thing to shoot a beam with, and I have no idea what it is, but it's pretty cool. Her gun is also, of course, incorporated on various attacks. It's her quick that's most interesting though, because it shoots a retro 50s style ray, which is nice and silly. Also, I noticed when seeing her MP in this form, why does she have a plaster on her stomach? Maybe it's part of the event. It's cute anyway. Her final form utilises the power of all the Saint Quartz she took from us for her skills, and her quick, where she uses it as like a bomb. She also frequently attacks using that morphing thing, even turning it into a Beyblade. She isn't afraid to get into the thick of things though. For her extra card, she just jumps in and starts beating the shit out of the enemy with lightning punches and an especially cool kick. She has some great sound effects too, especially for the buster cards. The vroom of the laser and sound of the energy ball are great. It's nice really that one of the most aesthetically pleasing servants and that they have put a lot of work into is actually one of the best as well of the year and is actually usable. For Christmas we get Bunny Boy Astolfo in our stockings, a limited quick saber with a double quick double arts deck and a single target NP that NP seals the enemy and also buffs his quick for 3 turns. I smell a looper. His stats are fairly average, being number 43 in the game for attack and 7th out of the 11 sabers by 2021. His HP is a little higher though, at 39th in the game and 5th of the sabers. His first skill is a debuff clear and battery over time, 20% per turn for 3 turns, like Vinci Rider. Then with his next skill he can apply terror to enemies, pretty much the same as how Abigail's works if you've ever used her. It's also a 3-hit evade for himself for 3 turns. The terror being on the same skill as the evade does reduce the chance that all the evade hits will be used up or needed, but it's all less damage taken regardless. Last skill has 3 effects, all for 3 turns on a 5-turn cooldown. It increases attack by 20%, crit damage by a fairly small 30%, and increases Buster Star Gather, which I don't get. In a deck with 1 Buster card, what good is a Gather buff for Buster? Like, it might even be actively harmful, because there's a good chance this Buster card isn't even going to be what you want to use in a lot of scenarios. It might not really matter, but it's just really confusing to me. He has a passive quick up to go with his deck and NP, and bonus debuff resist. And then his Bun CE gives himself 30% NP damage and leans into his third skill's effect by giving him 100% extra crit damage for his Buster card. For the first 3 turns only though. I still don't get it, but whatever. For his animations, while there's nothing crazy in terms of different ascensions, they seem to be the same throughout. What's there is good. He uses a chainsword rather than a normal one, and his animations make full use of it, with it kind of enveloping the enemy in his NP and being used in almost all of his attacks. He uses it to basically swing on the enemy to get close, and does a lovely little twirl with it as well. For his extra card he does a lot of little slashes all around the enemy, and ends it with a small pink beam from the sword. The way he holds it though, while shooting, kinda looks like he's holding a wand to me. Lastly, for one of his skill animations he takes full advantage of his costume and does a floppy bunny ear motion with his hands. The perfect animation. One of the last servants of the year is a permanent AoE Buster Rider with a Nier deck who seems to be really proud of her underwear. She has pretty good stats, having the 4th highest attack of the riders, but the absolute lowest in health, which her kit helps make up for though. Overall, she's 41st in attack, and all the way down in 97th for HP. Her first skill is basically protection from arrows on an SSR that's invincibility instead of evade, and makes it very hard to get debuffed, also for 3 times. Her second skill is a 30% Arts Buster buff alongside a 30% charge. And then finally she has an AoE charm with a 60% chance that also decreases enemy defense and crit rate by 20%. Between this, her first skill, and the defense buff on her MP, she should be pretty sticky despite her HP. Her passives also further increase her debuff resist, give her a quick up, and some small flat damage. Her Bun CE increases Arts and Buster like her second skill by 10% for the whole party. With her attack stat and damage buffs, she'll do more than reasonable damage even without an MP interlude. It won't be anything crazy, but her kit should keep her alive for a long time in exchange. By far the most important thing though is that she rides an awesome bull and has the big O in her MP. and judging by the bull she may not actually be Greek at all and is instead secretly a maker. As you'd imagine, the bull does a lot of the attacking for her, but she also attacks with a harp, which she uses to shoot lightning, and to summon her mech for a tight chest beam in her extra. The mech is also what attacks in her buster cards, stomping and punching the enemy with just a wave of her hand. Lastly, her sleepy skill animation is just so cute. Sharing the banner with Europa is the last servant of the year, Super Orion. A limited face card archer with a triple buster deck and the highest attack of any archer and 10th in the game overall. His HP isn't terrible either, being 7th of the archers and 67th in the game. A little unusually for a straight up DPS, his NP is only buffs and doesn't do any damage. It gives him 30 to 50% attack depending on MP level, 10 stars per turn, 100% crit buff increasing with overcharge, and while they say for 3 turns, in reality his invincibility, pierce and debuff immunity are probably going to be basically permanent. Changing things up and looking at his passives first, he has the highest rank of independent action, giving him 12% crit damage. He has a flat bonus damage as well as a damage cut, and a pretty minor demerit of taking 20% extra poison damage. Oh no. Going into his skills now, his first skill is a mana burst with an extra 50% against demonic or wild beast enemies. His second is a guts with 50% uptime and a 3 turn 20% attack buff that also gives him a whole 20 stars when you use it. And his last skill is a Stargather buff, but it also has an unusual crit buff. It increases his crit strength for 1 turn, seems to have a typo here saying 1 time instead of turn, by 100% every time he uses a buster card for the next 3 times or 3 turns. It can be a little bit confusing of a skill, but basically the next 3 times you use one of his buster cards within 3 turns of using the skill, it'll give him 100% crit damage. The 100% crit also applies before the damage of the actual card, which means that because it is a 1 turn crit buff and not 1 time, with a Buster Brave chain, you're going to have a lot of crit damage by the end. For the first buster card, it'll give itself 100% crit damage, then the second card will give another crit buff that will stack, so his second card would have 200% crit, and then lastly his third and final buster card would have a whole 300% crit damage. And that's just from his third skill. He also has the comparatively minor but still important 12% passive crit, and at least 100% from his NP if it wasn't overcharged. And now here's the thing, even with his triple buster deck, he can loop his NP. He's actually so goddamn insane that he can actually loop his NP even off of buster crits, if there's an art's first bonus, like he can get from his NP. So, all in all, his damage potential is insane. Altogether, if you were to loop his NP a couple times and then Buster Brave on the third turn and use all his skills, he would have given himself a total of 40 stars, and his last buster card would have an extra 80% attack, 50% buster, and 512% extra crit damage. It is absolutely crazy. And while to do that example he'd probably have to be solo, it's not like teammates don't have a lot to offer as well. I honestly think, in my opinion, he is the most broken servant of the year, even over Arjuna Alter. But that in practice, Arjuna is more impactful because of how versatile he is. Not even because Super Orion is an archer and Arjuna Alter is a Berserker. Super Orion can crit so hard he doesn't even need class advantage. He's pretty much a universal critter. Even Lancers can still get fucked by him. But instead, because Arjuna Alter is AoE and farming is 90% of the game, and he can handle any of it, as well as being able to crit for crazy damage when you need him to, Super Orion also requires, at least optimally, some setup and time to ramp up, as well as access to face cards. So Arjuna Alter is still pretty much more broken in that he can basically play the whole game for you, but holy shit, at what Super Orion does and what he can do, it's just, to me anyway, on a whole nother level. He basically breaks the game's whole class advantage system. His Bond CE is also another really good one, on paper, because it's probably not what you'd want to actually use on him himself, but it gives 8 stars per turn, like a 2030, and also increases party crit by 15%. It might be useful solo, but I doubt it would be best, and that kinda contradicts its party-wide effect. But it's still very good for a Bond CE, and definitely usable. It'd be fantastic if he could give it to his teammates somehow, but on him himself, yeah, it's not maybe the thing you would most want. By far the most incredible thing about him though, in spite of all the craziness he has in his kit, is the fact that he's an archer that actually uses a bow. They said it couldn't be done, but here we are. Although he does kinda lob it at the enemies sometimes, and he tends to shoot other weapons instead of arrows, but still. He also melees enemies with his club and the axe blade attached to his bow. He sometimes goes full caveman too and just gets his fist out, because for a Chad as big as him they're as good as any weapon. The last hit of his quick is just a straight up backhand too. His NP animation has him ascend to the heavens and either get a lovely sweet little hug, or pretty much get his neck snapped by Artemis. All in all, it's pretty fitting that he's such an Oonga Boonga servant when he basically looks like a caveman. His third ascension is more civilised looking though, if you do prefer. And with that, with the Grand Archer, that's everyone. All the 5-star servants coming out this year. I might make a video or two on all the 4 stars and welfares and free servants coming out, but I don't know, it won't be for a while at least, because this ended up taking a really long time. I'll definitely make a video like this for 2022 as well though, long before the new year, because the reason I wanted to make this originally was that it was like September and the new year was getting close, but there still wasn't much coverage of what was coming and what to plan for. So if you want to see that or anything else, then please subscribe. Even if you're not too sure, I'd appreciate if you made the leap and subbed, as until I'm at 1,000, I'm a little limited by YouTube. I wouldn't really be making any money anyway, but I'm pretty sure it also affects how the algorithm feels about my videos. So I'd appreciate it if you could, even if you're not sure, and just unsub later if I'm annoying you or whatever in your sub box. And also do the other YouTube things like commenting and liking the video if you would like. There's a few things I would genuinely like to hear people's opinions on anyway. Please give me any and all constructive feedback you can as well, like on the length of each servant's section for example. There's a huge variance. It's ended up being that some are very long and basically reviews, while some are just quick kinda looks. Do you prefer them shorter? Do you mind it varying? Do you want them all longer and more like full reviewy? If you'd rather I kept it shorter, do you think I should just make reviews when servants come out? There's already a lot of people making servant reviews though, and I'm actually pretty new to the game, so I'm not sure I would be the best person, or feel confident enough in my game knowledge. What about having the animations play in the background and stuff, or how busy the screen can get when putting information up on it, and positioning of that information and skill information and stuff? How is my voiceover? Am I hard to understand? Is my accent too much? Do I just not sound very compelling to listen to? What about gaps between talking even? Just BGM even? And background music or volumes? Just basically anything that you could possibly think of. I would really appreciate the feedback, especially if I am going to make another one like this for the free servants or for next year or anything. I would very much prefer to make a better video next time and have more of an idea of what I'm doing. I don't have a JP account, so unbelievably massive credit to everyone that uploads animation footage, everyone whose footage I used for the video. I couldn't show any of it myself, so I had to use other people's, and I hope it's okay. Links are all in the description. They're definitely worth checking out anyway, because there's lots of animations that got covered up by the stuff I was able to put on screen. There's lots of sound effects especially that are really cool that I obviously couldn't show and let you hear. Definitely worth checking out the original videos and going to those channels when you want to see the animations for a new servant and everything. Credit for everything else is also in the description. Resources I used, any memes, art, or anything should all be in the description if I haven't been an idiot. And if I have been an idiot, let me know. Shout at me. Give me a beating in the comments. So, thanks for watching, good luck on your rolls, and have a better year than the last one.